Welcome to Offcode, the show where we ignore the cultural codes and have real and intriguing conversations regarding the Black community and ways we can move forward to human flourishing.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Offcode. I am Monique Duson.
And I am Kevin Briggins, and we are so happy to be back with y'all. New year,
Welcome to 2025. I know.
Yes. I'm just excited for this year and what we've got lined up and planned for Offcode, and I'm just excited.
Me too. We starting off strong with Chad Jackson.
Ooh, yes. My brother Chad. So if you guys remember, 2 years ago, we had Chad on to talk about exposing the lives of Black history. And that episode opened a lot of people's eyes, started a lot of different conversations. Well, he has a new project out, and so we want to talk to him about this new project. And I think it's going to challenge some ideas that people have. It's going to challenge some things that people kind of hold dear to them. But it's something that needs to be said and put out there,
I think so too. And, plainly, we are going to be talking about King and the Civil Rights Movement. But, this morning I texted you and was like, what are going to be the biblical takeaways that, we really want our viewers, our family to walk away with? And I love how you put it. And I'm actually going to read it directly from the text because I don't want to miss what you said. You said, 1, that truth matters. 2, godly character is greater than social justice, and envy and anger are not fruits of the spirit. So much of what we saw, what we've seen since 2020 has been a lot of divisiveness in regards to racial things or the promotion of ungodly ideas or ideals. And a lot of this has hinged on, conversations around the civil rights movement or Martin Luther King and things like that. And so as we are unpacking this conversation with Chad about King, I want us, and I know that that's your heart too, is that we would remember that, godly character is greater than social justice and that truth matters. And for a very long time in our country, Dr. King has been heroed and put on a platform as one of the greatest of all time. That narrative can be challenged. And I think that as Christians, it's worth it to investigate who was he as a human person? Who was he as a leader? I think humans are complicated. And so you get humans that are, great and amazing, and they do these great things, but then they also do things that make us question and can be disappointing and, are not in line with biblical values. And so as we talk about King, my heart is, that you would be able to hold King in that regard too, as someone who may have been a great orator, but at the same time may not have been upholding biblical values, conservative values, the good of our republic, as well as some may have taught us that he did. Does that make sense, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good way to set people up, because I think the word I used earlier was shock value, kind of with some of these clips and what's going to be in this documentary. And it really is a documentary. It is factual, it is evidence-based, and it's going to provide some things that people have never heard before, and they've never seen Dr. King in this light to understand who he was and what he was really trying to accomplish. And so, I think that was a good way to put it.
And I don't know if Chad out here for the shock value. I think he just I said what I said.
Oh, absolutely. No, it's not for shock value.
You know what I mean? I said what I said. And
I just know the effects of it.
Yes. So I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation. This is actually the show that you put together. I am so grateful for that. You have all of it lined out. So I'm going to sit here and let you just take the reign. Go ahead.
So like I said, Chad has a new project out, and it's going to be coming out on the 20th. So this airs on the 19th, Sunday. Monday, the 20th, MLK Day, this documentary comes out, and we'll provide links and things like that for people to find it. But what we're going to show is a clip that is a promo for this new documentary, and then we'll bring Chad on to talk about it.
What is the state of modern conservatism in America?
They're demon rats.
No, he's a rhino.
Is it strong and reliable, capable of preserving our constitutional republic? Or is it weak, pathetic, and unprincipled?
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
On January 20th, Trump will be inaugurated once again as the President of the United States.
The theme for this year's Martin Luther King Jr. holiday.
Also on January 20th is so-called Martin Luther King Day. Now, while Trump is giving his speech, I'm sure he's going to invoke Martin Luther King and talk about how great of a man he was. The problem with that is King was no conservative.
Undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power.
In fact, most of the things that King advocated for were actually hostile to America, not pro-America, contrary to what you've learned in your public schools. So why is it that so-called conservatives insist on placing MLK on this pedestal? Trump isn't the only one.
Goes against everything Martin Luther King has ever told us.
The Reverend Dr. King famously said,
I have a dream that my...
I have a dream speech, right? One of the great speeches in American rhetorical history.
He was passionately pro-Constitution.
As eloquent and polished as many of your favorite conservative influencers and commentators are, why are they so naive to the clandestine and covert nature of Marxian globalists, credulously going along with the propagandized narrative rather than challenging their audiences to not be so simple-minded when it comes to what's really at play?
Nearly 60 years later, radical far-left Democrats are doing everything possible to eliminate this dream through the implementation of critical race theory.
How can you take a stand against critical race theory and DEI and Black Lives Matter when you support the civil rights movement, which is the very foundation on which those things stand? There's another thing that will be happening on January 20th. I will be releasing a project, or at least part of a project, that exposes the civil rights movement for what it really was. The Bible says, do not be taken captive by hollow and deceptive philosophies. This isn't about Republican versus Democrat. The truth is deeper and bigger than that. The question is, are you ready for it?
I don't know if we're ready for it.
Boy, I don't know if I'm ready. Okay. Here we go.
Well, let's bring Chad on. Chad O. Jackson is a producer, researcher, filmmaker, 1/4 of the Negro Spirituals, and and a friend of the show. Chad, welcome, man.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Monique. Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us again. We are definitely appreciative of your time and are looking forward to this conversation. Why don't we just start out by telling us, if you can tell us a little bit about the project and about your co-contributors. I know Vince Ellison is working with you in this, and Chuck Littleton. So tell us a little bit about what y'all have going on.
Yeah, so we're putting together a project that looks not only at Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, but we seek to give greater nuance and understanding and clarity, quite frankly, to what led up to Martin Luther King, why he was important to the civil rights movement, how the civil rights movement itself was a bit of a Trojan horse. I think that's the best way to put it, seeking to first and foremost subvert the church, and then from there, co-opt American ideals to expand the role of the federal government. And so we're going to be telling that story. We start from the beginning of America, and we mentioned slavery, and we mentioned some of the things that happened after slavery. So we try to give a robust understanding to make sense of the claims that we're making. And the reason I think it's important to do that is because it's difficult to tell the truth about the civil rights movement and about Martin Luther King in particular when you're faced against the backdrop of the curriculum that we all received in our public schools growing up. That is to say that we have this understanding of the past that is at odds with the facts. And it's because, as the old saying goes, history is written by the victors. And so who are the victors? All the victors are individuals who are not unbiased in their beliefs or in their approaches. These are people who are themselves ideologues and have a very leftist and in some cases a Marxist bent. And these are the folks who are responsible for designing and establishing the curriculum that we all are exposed to in our schools. And so it doesn't matter whether you're right or left. None of that really matters at the end of the day because we all receive the same education. And so we start from the same basic premise. This is the reason why even those who call themselves conservatives make heroes out of individuals who had views that were hostile to America in some cases, views that are Marxist in other cases, and sometimes both. And because we are unprincipled, those of us who are educated in our American schools, because we are unprincipled in our beliefs, we fall for a lot of things and people and ideologies that are at odds with the truth. And so hopefully by the releasing of this documentary, we'll attempt to bring clarity and understanding to at least some of those who are willing to watch it.
So at the end of Uncle Tom 2, which was highly successful, you left us on a cliffhanger. And that cliffhanger was that there was something coming about Dr. King. And I remember when it ended, I was like, oh man, I can't wait for this. Is this what you were teasing? Is this the project you were teasing at the end of Uncle Tom 2?
So the original idea was to do a Uncle Tom Part 3.
Yeah.
So as you know, the executive producer of Uncle Tom Part 2, and Part 1 for that matter, is Larry Elder. And the Uncle Tom franchise is owned by Malone Pictures. Malone Pictures currently is working on a film called Comrade Yuri. The date for that release is to be determined. I personally don't work for Malone Pictures. I'm completely independent in my endeavors. But as far as the Uncle Tom Part 3, I'm not sure whether something like that will take place.
Okay.
I sure hope it will. I know myself and Larry, we're on good terms. Myself and the folks over at Malone Pictures are on good terms. So there's no kind of behind the scenes animosity or anything like that. It's just a simple fact of my view is that because I've had these relationships with folks like Chuck and I thought that now was a time to take a stab at releasing this information, especially before 2027, when a lot of the FBI files and things of that nature are supposed to be released. That's not to say that something like Uncle Tom 3 isn't forthcoming. We just haven't begun doing the groundwork and interviewing and everything of that nature for it. But this film is going to be more focused once again on Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, whereas Uncle Tom Part 3 is going to be a more broad-reaching subject matter. So yeah.
Okay.
So when we last talked, you said that you had like a ton of footage left over from Uncle Tom 2. Is what we're seeing in your new documentary a lot of that footage, or are you saving that footage for a different project and all of this is brand new information that you're bringing over?
Truth be told, there's enough footage for the documentary that I'm making, Uncle Tom Part 3, and about 5 or 6 other documentaries after that. Just because there's just so much. There's really just so much. One of the things that the Marxists were really good at across the 20th century was really capitalizing on this new technology that is video, film capturing. And they pretty much captured a lot of video footage for the purpose of propagandizing and really making their figures seem larger than life. And so the benefit of having that information today is we can look at it with clear eyes. And, you know, we are in the age of information. And so, I mean, we have tons of archived information, books that are out of print, books that are still in print. I mean, I have all of Martin Luther King's volumes of his papers. I personally have gone and looked at the papers that are not yet released to the public because not everything could fit in 7 volumes. So there's plenty of information, and it's just one of those things that once you have the information, once you're aware of the information, it's just hard to unsee it, and it's difficult for someone like me who is first and foremost a believer, but second of all live in this country of ours that has a Martin Luther King holiday to, you know, endure year after year after year of celebrating this man. It's very cringy to hear him being celebrated in the church, particularly. But one of the things that I just kind of have to remember is that the narrative as it was presented to us is just so pervasive and so widespread that it's not surprising that people don't know the information. So with that, I've resolved to try to make as many people aware of the information as possible.
Before we look at the information that you uncovered, can you just help us understand, like, what started you on this journey of, wanting to quote unquote uncover Dr. King, or wanting to research Dr. King? Like, I don't see you as being just this person who wakes up one day and is like, forget Dr. King, I can't stand him. You know what I mean? So what was it that really sparked that interest in you to go down this road so in depth and to really pull out all of this information?
That's actually a very layered question, and I'll try to answer it the best way I can. So I grew up in the church. I grew up, in fact, Church of God in Christ. And, our church had a great admiration for Dr. King. Small church house. You go in and you see the fans with Martin Luther King's profile there on the front of it. And the church I went to wasn't super social justice, but there were tinges of social justice in the church. And so as I came of age and began reading the Bible for myself and realized that the social gospel, the so-called social gospel, was actually blasphemous. It wasn't, it's what Paul would have said, called a counterfeit gospel. He said, let those who preach it be accursed. When I became aware of what the social gospel was and how James Cone was a perpetrator of liberation theology, and I realized that James Cone was a Marxist, I always separated King from the whole social justice movement, from the whole social gospel movement, the whole liberation theology movement. He was always one that you don't touch because he made such great measures to try to bring the races together, and he was a moral leader of the 20th century and everything else that we've been told. But I was kind of forced to look more into King as we were doing the research for Uncle Tom Part 2. And the more I researched him and looked into him, the more the truth became blatantly obvious. And it was one of those things where I felt like I was lied to my entire life. And I felt offended by that. Not just for the sake of being lied to, but for the fact that here's a man who literally walked around under this kind of moniker of being a reverend, of being a pastor. And he used that to legitimize his position in this quest to subvert the church and to do his part to expand the role of the federal government. And so because of that, I felt the need to do what I can to make other folks aware of this information, especially those who are believers, so that they're not falling for a counterfeit gospel. They're not falling for something that's not the genuine, true gospel of the Bible. So that's really what it boils down to. I wear a hoodie often that says "Worship God, not man," and the reason why I wear that hoodie is because of the fact. Martin Luther King, he's the one who kind of sparked this idea in my mind. Just learning more about his beliefs and everything else as it relates to Martin Luther King. How we have literally put this man on a pedestal. I mean, there's a 40-foot monument to him in Washington, D.C., which, by the way, doesn't mention anything about him being a reverend or a Christian. It's all about his social activism, which tells you everything you need to know. Which, by the way, why would a secular society, a God-hating society, who insists on a separation of church and state, why would that same society, that same community, edify, or not edify, but glorify someone like a Martin Luther King, who was supposed to be a pastor? Again, this tells you everything that you need to know. The only reason why the government would go through such pains to try to exalt someone is if they stand to benefit from that person's clout. And in Martin Luther King's case, the government, the federal government in particular, stands to benefit from Martin Luther King's clout insofar that they continually invoke MLK anytime it comes time to push some new policy which would expand the government's role. So the government benefits from exalting Martin Luther King in this way. And so again, because I want for people to worship God and not man, it's to that extent that I want to communicate to people that he's not who we are told he is.
Yeah. You and I have a similar story. When I started to study the Word of God for myself, because I grew up in, like you said, the Black church, very traditional. You in the Kojic, I was in the missionary Baptist circles. Like you said, King was untouchable. And when I began to study the Word of God for myself, and I started to realize, things like the social gospel and liberation theology and all of those types of things, and I realized how prominent they were within the Black church, and how me searching for a church that was just faithfully teaching the Word was almost impossible, because it was so entrenched in social justice and the social gospel and liberation theology. I believe it was around 2007. So before social media, I was saying things like the civil rights movement is the worst thing that ever happened to the Black church, because without even knowing all the information that you've dug up, I could see that there was a shift within the church where we went from solid, sound theology, our faith in God, to a switch to our faith being in government, and everything being centered around being liberated from some earthly plight, right? And so what I did not know was the ill intentions behind it, the intentionality behind it. I just could see that there was something that changed, and that change wasn't good, And so, yeah, I completely relate to kind of how you stumbled across this, because I saw it a long time ago. I just didn't have I just never dug into the research. And so when I saw Uncle Tom too, it hit me so hard, because I was like, I've been seeing this. I just didn't have I didn't know how to put the narrative together.
Yeah.
I didn't understand the intentions behind it, but I definitely appreciate your work in doing this, because it is so prominent, because we see it every election cycle, but even when it's not an election cycle, we see how the Black community and the Black church are so tied politically to a particular narrative and a particular party. And we know how that has just been detrimental to so many things that we deal with in the Black community today are things post-Civil Rights Act, right? And so it's just been kind of mind-opening to see this kind of laid out, to give a framework for understanding how we got here today. And so in your documentary, you uncovered something that I thought was very interesting about Dr. King. And you mentioned a school called the Highlander Folk School. And I don't think most people have ever heard of it. I know I had never heard of it. And so I want to play the clip from the documentary, and then we can come back and have you kind of dig in and talk about kind of what this means.
You can call this information a bombshell if you'd like, but understand that the only reason you would call it that is because in school we were all taught the myth.
Mrs. Parks sat.
If you're taught mythology and propaganda for so long, and the truth finally comes out, it does feel like a bomb went off. And here's the bomb, here's the fact. In 1932, there was a communist named Don West, and a fellow traveler, his friend, named Miles Horton.
Miles Horton was its founder.
Together, in Tennessee, they started what was called the Highlander Folk School.
The school was a new beginning.
The Highlander Folk School was responsible for training young communist organizers and leftists in the work of infiltration, agitation, instigation, and subversion.
The school took roots among the people. They learned the principles of organization, history, science, economics. What are the problems of the world? How to unite the people. Why there is poverty and why there is war. How to organize, how to conduct a meeting.
They taught their students how to use clandestine means to push a Marxist agenda.
The school taught the people to think and to organize. Who's against us? The men who won't look and won't listen. Who's for us? The government.
Now, of course, we all learn in school that in 1956, there was a famous Montgomery bus boycott. What we don't learn is that in the early 50s, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, who the Montgomery bus boycott is centered around, actually attended the Highlander Folk School. This is notable considering the fact that we were made to believe that in 1956, a young Negro minister named Martin Luther King felt a sense of urgency to stand up and organize for a random seamstress.
Just the other day, one of the fine citizens of our community, Mrs. Rosa Parks, was arrested because she refused to give up her seat for a white passenger. Mrs. Rosa Parks was arrested and taken down to jail, taken from the bus, just because she refused to give up her seat. At present, we are in the midst of a protest, the Negro citizens of Montgomery. 90% at least of the regular Negro bus passengers are staying off the buses, and we plan to continue until something is done.
As it turns out, the whole thing was actually planned and organized by E.D. Nixon of the Montgomery Improvement Association, who was also the president of a labor organizing communist front group for a number of years. Much of what we learned about Martin Luther King was actually a facade, including the whole nonviolence thing.
I feel that organized nonviolent resistance is the most powerful weapon that oppressed people can use in breaking loose from the bondage of oppression.
Nonviolence didn't originate with him. He learned that also at the Highlander Folk School, who used those same tactics with all-white labor unions 30 plus years before Martin Luther King's leadership in the Civil Rights Movement.
The school and the unions working together, training the people to organize.
700 police. Guns, tear gas, clubs, and fists bring injuries to more than 80 persons and cause the death of 2. Listen to the strikers' side of the story.
We are asking for a general strike to keep organized labor on the Pacific Coast. We're not only asking for it, but we're going to get it.
Just like in the 60s, when mass crowds of black demonstrators were marching in places where they didn't pull a permit, were dispersed by way of dogs and hoses. Entirely white crowds were dispersed in the same way from the early to mid 20th century because this was a common way to disperse crowds in those days. When it comes to the Montgomery bus boycott, under the behest of King, Parks, and others, the whole thing was a ruse, and it worked like a charm.
We're going to write a poem together about Rosa Parks.
Unfortunately, our generation, by way of our schools, have been conditioned to be soft when it comes to hearing and understanding hard truths. And here's a hard truth. Up until that point, many blacks were not at all fazed by many of the segregation ordinances, which, by the way, were being repealed or overthrown in both the private and public sector.
Up to this present time, it hasn't affected me at all. As far as my work and my social activities, up until this present time, I can say it hasn't affected me.
Dr. Claude Anderson went on to The Breakfast Club, and he told Leonard McKelvey, who calls himself Charlemagne the God. Of course, I don't call any man the God, so I will refer to him as Leonard. He told Leonard that prior to the 60s, many blacks were focused on self-improvement and economic development, and they were not at all concerned about integrating with white folks.
Black folk had up 100 times more before social integration hit. See, I'm old enough to tell you all that. You all not old enough to know that yet. Mm-hmm. We weren't looking for this social integration. You know why? Because we had our own businesses
and that it wasn't until the Montgomery bus boycott that blacks began to shift their focus.
We don't kill our buses.
Right.
Social integration. When all of a sudden you all start talking about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King going down to Alabama, want to integrate the bus lines. Integrate whose bus lines? Blacks in Winston-Salem says, we want to ride on fronts of white buses. So we said, we don't have any white buses. They said, well, we'll get some so we can ride on in front of them.
To Leonard, and I'm sure also to a lot of his listeners who have the misfortune of being miseducated in our schools, what Dr. Anderson was saying seemed to be a novel idea, something that no one has ever thought of before.
I feel like a complete asshole because I never thought about that. Like that whole time they did the boycott, they should have been trying to establish their own bus company as opposed to wanting to ride. I never thought about that. Y'all boycotted for a year just to want to ride on the front?
See, you're a smart man.
I never thought about that.
In reality, not only was it thought of before, and blacks like Claude Anderson's family actually owned buses, the idea was actually pitched to Martin Luther King at the time by Reverend Joseph H. Jackson, who offered to buy black-owned buses for the blacks in Montgomery, but Martin Luther King turned him down and said no, that wouldn't be wise. Reverend Jackson and his church still supported the boycott, going so far as to raise and donate $1,000 to the efforts, which equates to $11,000 in today's dollars. Jackson later realized that those involved in organizing the boycott were actually not being very honest at all, and that they were using the facade of integration to disrupt black business prospects in pursuit of a larger Marxist social order. When you finally understand that the existence of a black-owned business within the context of the American system is actually a threat to the communist philosophy, which believes
my hope is that we're able to, in a sense, articulate why MLK was more of a detriment to the church and to American society at large than he was a benefit. Because even after presenting the information that you see here, of course, if you scroll through those comments, you see a lot of yeah, but. And again, it's like when you look at the church in particular, when you look at the state of social justice today and just black activism, one of the things that you see is this they carry on as if they don't know what forgiveness is. For many of them, they have nothing to forgive because they're not treated in this kind of discriminate way that they let on. Some of them maybe, but most of them no. And in fact, as we argue in that clip, many of the narratives that we hear concerning the past aren't even true. One of the common tactics of the Communist Party in those days was to set fire to their own homes, or to set fire to the home of one of their agents and say, look at what the Klan is doing, so as to win sympathy from black folks, particularly black sharecroppers and miners in the South. Because it was a race for hierarchy, if you will. The hierarchy, particularly for the Southern Negroes back then, was the minister and the businessmen. These were the ones that the youngsters aspired to be like, and they stood, of course, in the way. They were an obstacle to communist prospects, and so one of the things that they set out to do was to undermine the Negro minister and the Negro business. And it's for this reason that they resolved to set fire to a lot of businesses, set fire to a lot of churches, and making it look like the Klan did it. Now, that's not to say that the Klan was this innocent organization that never did any wrong. I'm not saying that at all. But the fact is, the Klan was a very disorganized organization. As Roland G. Fryer pointed out in his 2011 report on the Klan was nothing more than a Ponzi scheme. It was a pyramid scheme. And whenever they enjoyed their highest recruit rates in the 1920s, at the same time, lynching was at an all-time low. The KKK was infiltrated by the communists who were able to incite violence from within the organization, targeting specifically Black churches and Black businesses. And the reason why they did this is because Blacks were increasingly becoming more entrepreneurial. They were buying property. They were doing all the so-called capitalist things. And the basic fact is, to the extent that that Blacks began to assimilate to the American way of making a living, they had no use for the NAACP or for the communists. And so the idea was to try to scare Black folks into the arms of the communists, into the arms of the NAACP and other such organizations. And so when you look at the narrative, so everything that I just said is the facts that we found to be true. The narrative, on the other hand, is that no, the Klan were responsible. They hated Blacks. They hated Jews. They hated this. They hated that. They're the enemy. The communists were the good guys, but we don't recognize them as a communist. We recognize them as other front groups and organizations and unions and things of this nature. The NAACP and the Civil Rights Movement. That's what we recognize them as. And these are the ones who came and saved the day. These are the ones who have long been champions of Black folk. And so because that's the backdrop, because that's the undergird from where we start, naturally, we have this predisposition of I identify with the struggle. My people have long been a part of the struggle. Everything's about the struggle. And from that mindset, or in that mindset, there's no room for forgiveness at all. So again, Martin Luther King was one of the champions of the instilling of this idea into the Black conscience. And so again, that's not very Christian, because as Christians, we're told to forgive. One of the things that the Marxists would do often, and they got this tactic from Vladimir Lenin there in the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, was to take a legitimate issue and exploit that issue, blow it out of proportion, exploit it, so as to try to propagandize the masses into coming over to your side. This is what Vladimir Lenin was successfully able to do, and in Russia. And I have a book here. It's called Hammer and Hoe, written by Robin Kelly, and in it he talks about how there was one communist who he interviewed who was a sharecropper organizer in the South. And when he went to the sharecropper's shack, the sharecropper told him, well, I keep Lenin in one hand and the Bible in the other, because these are where I get my tactics from, right? So anyway, so all that to say that Marxists have long set their sights on the church. When you look at the beginning of the Highlander Folk School, which was started by one of the individuals, Don West. Don West was a Methodist minister who, like King, didn't believe in the literal existence of heaven or hell, didn't believe in the deity of Christ, didn't believe in, on and on we can go, the basic tenets of the Christian faith. What he did believe, however, is that the Bible had a lot of interesting lessons to learn. And he believed that since there is no existence of heaven, we can build our own heaven on earth. We can do so through social justice. We can give everybody free health care and free food and free housing, and we can have this kind of brotherly love. We can build our own heaven on earth. And so, of course, those teachings, mingled with those of Walter Rauschenbusch and others, is what developed King's theology, if you can call it that. And so he set out to do exactly what he was taught to do and taught about in terms of building this heaven on earth. This is the reason why he launched the Poor People's Campaign, and this is the reason why he did et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't because he wanted man to come to know Christ on a personal level, but rather he desired to build a heaven on earth because he didn't believe heaven existed. So what many so-called Black churches, where they find themselves today, is assisting in building block by block this heaven on earth that King set out to build. And it's unfortunate because some churches are doing so, and they are well-intentioned in what they're doing, and they believe that that they are right in what they are doing. They might be a little liberal in terms of their politics, and they might look at, issues as immigration and the border and other such in taxes and say, look, because we're Christians and because the Bible says we need to feed the poor and do these things, this is the reason why we have to vote in favor of politicians who are going to tax us more so as to feed the poor and to do these things. And there's a lot of error in what they're doing, because what they don't understand is that those on the so-called left, and I hate using these terms left and right, but those on the so-called left who are building these things, or building this new world order that they're trying to build, are not doing so from a Christian perspective, nor are they doing so with upright intentions. So why would the church assist the secular world and building something that's actually hostile to God? It's akin to building the Tower of Babel. You're trying to remove God from the context, and you by sheer will of your manpower are trying to build this tower that pays homage to no one but self. And look at me, look at what we did.
We hope you're enjoying our conversation with Chad O. Jackson. We are going to take a break and hear from our friends at Birmingham Theological Seminary, and then we'll be right back.
The heart of BTS is first and foremost to be faithful. Faithful to the Word of God, to the sufficiency of Scripture, to knowing we serve a sovereign Lord. The second component of the heart of BTS is accessibility. We're affordable, we're flexible, we work with students to help them achieve goals. This isn't our journey, it's your journey for serving the Lord. It's your journey that God has called you to. So we pray that while God expands and grows the opportunities that we have, that we never lose sight to provide quality, Reformed theological education, faithfully and accessibly, so that we can serve the local church by building leaders for His kingdom.
So we know critical race theory is from a Marxist worldview and understanding. And one of their tenets is interest conversion, saying that, hey, whites will not act in the interest of blacks until it's in their interest, right? Well, the example they use of that is the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, right? And what their claim is that the only reason that, United States and America and whites did not pass the Civil Rights Act because they saw their wrongs, and they say, no, they felt it was in their benefit. And what was in their benefit, they said, was to counter the Marxists or the communists, right? And so even in their own argument against, America, they admit the communist activity, right? And so their justification is, well, you only acted like that to counter the communists. Well, what communists are you talking about? How are we countering the communists, right? And so when you were talking about that, that just came to my mind of, they have said the quiet part out loud. They've admitted, their involvement. They're very proud of their involvement within the civil rights movement. We just kind of ignored it from a historical standpoint in our schools. We didn't talk about it. It is so prominent within the entire movement, within everyone who was surrounding Dr. King. We know Dr. King himself has his views. It's very out there that he was a fan of Marx and Hegel. But even his speechwriter, who's alive today, is a self-professed Marxist, and no one talks about that. The person who wrote the I Have a Dream speech today will tell you, I am a Marxist, and no one will talk about that. I find that mind-blowing that is not common knowledge and taught to us the Marxist influences behind a lot of the things that was going on. So I'm appreciative of your film for exposing this stuff, especially the narrative that the hoes and the dogs was just the racist thing against the black people. When you have footage of them doing the exact same thing to white unions, using the exact same nonviolent tactics, as the civil rights movement. And so, I just think it's beneficial that you've been exposing this stuff. You mentioned something about the mythology, that we believe the myths and the mythology of the civil rights movement. What are some of those things that we believe that are the mythology? What can you kind of flesh it out?
Yeah. So I guess the lowest hanging of fruit, to answer your question, would be the "I Have a Dream" speech, which you rightly point out was written by his advisors who were themselves Marxists, whether it be Clarence B. Jones or Bayard Rustin or Stanley Levison, who was a financier, a treasurer for a communist front group there in New York. And I think I mentioned this last time whenever I was on, so forgive me if I'm being redundant. But the "I Have a Dream" speech was a huge. It was a Trojan horse insofar that it kind of casted MLK as a moderate, as someone who just wants people to come together. He was very passionate in his delivery of the speech, which goes without saying. I mean, he was the son of a pastor, Daddy King, had a front row seat to watching his dad deliver sermons every Sunday. And he was a good imitator. He was really good at imitating, according to Ralph Abernathy, who wrote a book, "And the Walls Came Tumbling Down," shortly before he died in the 80s. He could mimic any preacher, or he just had that kind of like a Godfrey. I don't know if you're familiar with who the comedian Godfrey is, which most people don't know about MLK. But that the reason I mention that is because his oratory skills was predicated on the fact that he was just really good at mimicking and really good at like just putting on a good performance. And so the "I Have a Dream" speech, people believe it's this kind of unifying, moderate speech. John Wood Jr. Interviewed Tavis Smiley on his podcast, and he said that Martin Luther King is one of his greatest heroes. He's around my age, around 34, 35 years old, John Wood Jr. And he said that Martin Luther King is a founding father of the America we grew up in. And I would say that he's right in that, for different reasons than he says. But the "I Have a Dream" speech is similar to the Declaration of Independence insofar that it's the thing that launched him into international notoriety. In fact, Claiborne Carson, who was hired by Coretta Scott to edit these 7 volumes of the King Papers, is also responsible for doing the legwork to make Martin Luther King Day a national holiday. And he says, with his own words, and this is also going to be in the documentary, that we understood that using other speeches of MLK would not have landed him with a national holiday. We had to use that "I Have a Dream" speech because that's the speech that a lot of white people can resonate with. So that's the one that we use to launch him into notoriety. So when you look at that speech, when you listen to that speech from a Christian perspective, or even from a conservative perspective, if you just read it line by line, you'll realize that there's actually nothing Christian about it at all. There's actually nothing conservative about it at all, because he's still advocating for a lot of Marxist demands. But people cling to the being judged not by the color of my skin, but by the content of my character. These are the things that people cling to. But as Vince Ellison points out correctly, he says numerous times that the Negro is not free, the Negro is not free, the Negro is not free. When up until the Civil Rights Movement, Negroes didn't feel as if they weren't free. But what did happen was they had this kind of spirit of bitterness that was instilled, and then they were what's the word? They were made to feel discontent by a lot of the rhetoric that was coming out around the Civil Rights Movement, around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, that galvanized, especially many of the Black youth, and caused them to join the ranks of the movement. And then you see a drastic dip in just Black morale, and it had tangible effects too, as Bob Woodson and others have pointed out. When you look at the out of wedlock births that spiked after the Civil Rights Movement, went from 3 out of 4 Black children growing up in a home with 2 parents to 78+% of Black children being raised in a single parent household. So just the complete morale of the so-called Black community went completely down. And so for me, it's like, as someone who was born in 1990 and who has photo albums of my parents and my grandparents, and my great grandparents from a long lost time, who had community, who had all the things that my generation missed out on. I don't know. I almost get. I'm not a very emotional person, but I really do get emotional when thinking about that.
Yeah.
Because I feel like we were robbed. We were robbed because those who have the responsibility of fostering my generation were caught up in this movement. And as such, when you look at not only the civil rights movement, but when you look at a lot of the other social justice movements that were going on around the time, whether it be second wave feminism, whether it be gay liberation, whether it be on and on I can go, the free love movement, the hippie movement, the thing that they were really intrigued by was this new spirit of indulgence, this new spirit of do what thou wilt and fear not that any God will judge you for it. This is what they were feeling. And again, it shaped their mindset and how they began to move in the world. You see a drastic drop in birth rates, and you see, and then too, you see abortion. You see all these things that are predicated on the spirit of indulgence. A lot of Black people today talk about, well, we don't have any generational wealth because of slavery and Jim Crow. Well, that's not true. You don't have any generational wealth. And I made this point on the Negro spirituals. You don't have any generational wealth because your parents and grandparents decided to liquidate the assets from the houses they inherited and go on vacation. That's why you don't have generational wealth. But again, like, I feel like our generation was robbed, and I don't want to lay it at the feet of Martin Luther King or any one person. I think there was a overall kind of movement going on that kind of moved people into the spirit of indulgence, where they no longer have to think about the importance of family formation, the importance of the church community, the importance of the things that have made America great up until that point. This notion of segregation, even, it's not unique to America. In the aftermath of the Civil War, where you had the bitterness that was in the air as a result of having lost sons and brothers and fathers, it was actually wisdom in people separating. When Booker T. Washington delivered the speech in Atlanta at the Atlanta Exposition, which W.E.B. Du Bois dismissed as a compromise. He called it the Atlanta Compromise. And what did the historians do? They took that moniker and they printed that in the history book. So now our kids today know it as the Atlanta Compromise. That was titled to dismiss what Booker T. Washington was trying to do, which is say, look, we have to keep tensions down. We have to keep friction down. Blacks, we have to come together and we have to hone our skills. We have to focus on family formation. We have to be industrious and not worry about what other races or other people are doing. We have to just focus on ourselves. And to that extent, you'll begin to see those barriers break down. And this was actually working. This was actually being effective. It were the communists in the early part of the 20th century who were doing everything they can to sabotage and undermine that progress that was being made. And it is true that a lot of these Jim Crow laws were being repealed at the local, private, and even state level. So these were things that were actually happening. Booker T. Washington's predictions were actually unfolding the way that he said they would. But to the extent that the communists got involved, you had the reopening of old wounds, as Julia Brown would put it. You had this kind of vamping of race friction to the point where someone like a Martin Luther King became necessary in many people's minds. And so, again, this is my long roundabout way of answering your question, Kevin, of what was a myth. That was one of the biggest myths, that Martin Luther King had the answers. He had it all figured out, when in reality, he was from the contingent that actually exacerbated and created the problem to begin with.
One thing that stands out to me with what you're saying, for what I know about Marxists myself, they have to have a disgruntled proletariat. They have to have a disgruntled disenfranchised poor that they can galvanize. The more successful you become, the less their ideals appeal to you. And so they hate the middle class. They hate, when black people are becoming successful, that is a threat to their goals. And so it makes sense that they would want to undermine that upward trajectory that black people are on. Because once you get to the middle class and the upper class, the idea of revolution, the idea of overthrowing society and the structures of society no longer appeal to you because you don't feel like there's this great injustice being done to you.
Right.
But the way you do that is you stop that progress, you tell them that they're disenfranchised, and you galvanize them up as this movement to revolutionize and to tear down the structures of the society in which they're in. And I have seen that for decades. I've always said that's what the Democrats do, right? Open up the racial wounds. Tell black people we're oppressed. It's systemic racism. I mean, they've been doing that my whole life. At the time, I never tied it to Marxism. I just said, oh, that's just Democrats. But it makes, from an ideological standpoint, it makes so much sense, especially going all when you realize that was the tactic going all the way back to, King, that this is bigger, like you said, it's bigger than Democrat, Republican, right? This is a godless ideology that has devastated our community.
Right.
It has completely broken us down. And you say you get, emotional about what your generation missed out on. I'm a little bit older than you. What I miss is my grandparents, and not just miss them personally. I do miss their wisdom, but they had experiences prior to the 1960s. They were adults, and the things that people talk about today, they can't relate to, because that wasn't the reality of the truth that they lived through. And when you realize that the older generation in King's day rejected his message, when you realize that it was King's generation and the youth movement of the day, which Chad, you so perfectly pointed out several times, that's the generation that rebelled against their parents and their grandparents and said, we know better. We're going to bring this revolution in, sexual revolution, the civil rights movement, all of these things, this revolutionary spirit that was of the youth, and the youth took over. And what's the result? And so when you talk about King having more of a negative influence than a positive one, it's hard to argue with that when you look at the state of which the black community found itself in after his legacy. We might have a couple more dollars in our pocket. We might have, NBA stars that are $1 billion now. But we lost family, we lost community, we lost businesses, we lost our identity, and most importantly, we lost God. We lost our faith and our hope, because we got told that no, your faith and hope is in government and liberation from whitey, right? And that is the only thing that our churches have been teaching for decades now. And the result of it is we have a culture of debauchery, and that was not the culture from which we came from. That is not the culture of our grandparents. That is the culture that is the reflection of the spirit of rebellion and revolution of the 1960s, starting with Dr. King and all of those guys. And so I guess that's my soapbox, but I feel you in terms of it's the what if. That's a whole nother documentary. What if the civil rights movement never happened? What would we look like today?
Well, I mean, I know that everything works together, for the good of those who love the Lord and are called according to His purposes. And I know that the civil rights movement was allowed to happen within God's providential will.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from it. In the same way that, there are a lot of folks who were upset that Trump lost. And for me, in 2020, And for me, since my hope is not in politicians, and yes, I voted for Trump over Biden, I know that God is on the throne and that ultimately everything will work together for my good. And so what I was able to realize in Trump losing that 2020 election, or losing, depending on how you feel, whether it's legitimate or not, I learned a lot about myself, because I was able to kind of step back and look at, okay, to what extent was I emotionally involved or attached to this election, and to what extent is that healthy or unhealthy? And I was able to get back into the Word. And, that's not to say that I wasn't in the Word, but I was able to see with new eyes different things that were going on around me. So I think that in a roundabout way, you're able to get perspective due to the way that things did unfold. As I said earlier, you did see the repealing of certain Jim Crow laws, rules, ordinances, such and so forth, because that's what Jim Crow was. It was not one thing. It looked different depending on where you were in the country. And so it existed at the private sector, again, local, state, not so much federal, other than the fact that you have Plessy v. Ferguson, which was not repealed, but it was overturned with the Brown versus Board of Education. But again, you did see this kind of upward trajectory, this kind of falling off of these regulations. In some cases, it was based on the market, because businesses were finding that these rules were unfeasible, and so it became easier to just repeal them than to keep them. In other cases, giving credit to whom credit's due, the NAACP had something to do with the getting rid of some of these ordinances, but they were becoming less and less popular. It was to the extent that you had this kind of communist agitation that you saw these rules and these Jim Crow laws lasting much longer than they would have otherwise lasted, because you had the reactionaries who were, well, you know what? Because of that, segregation today, segregation yesterday, segregation forever.
Yeah.
All that stuff would not have happened if not for this repeated kind of like poking and prodding and agitation that was going on.
Yeah. And I want to make something clear too, because you're talking about the agitation. Dr. King and his followers were viewed as troublemakers. And not just from the white community, from the black community, because blacks were not going through this turmoil that we think we see on these footages. That stuff was staged by people agitating. Yeah. Yes. Right. They were agitating to make a scene, but that was not the ordinary everyday lives of black folks. Right. And so in a sense, they were coming into town to cause trouble, to stir things up. And that's what nobody liked, and that's what we're not told. We are not told of the level of like the black community that did not rock with King. The fact that he tried to take over the National Baptist Convention and couldn't do it. And so he left with his followers and started the Progressive National Baptist Convention. Right.
That's correct.
But we got told that he was this hero and this saint of the black community. It's like, no, he wasn't. He was very controversial. And there were a lot of black people who were very pro-civil rights, but were highly against Dr. King's tactics, right? In which you have done a great job of pointing out why they were against those tactics and where he got them from, Right. It was the Marxist tactics, and he was coming in and causing trouble, causing the agitation to cause a scene. And yeah, we need people to understand that when you see that footage, that is the backdrop of the footage. So Chad, I have a question. When it comes to King and Marx, some people might say, well, he wasn't really a Marxist, or they might think that label doesn't fit because King kind of had some critiques of Marxism, at least in the public. Two of the things that I've kind of heard from my reading is that he was kind of against Marx's kind of like economic determinism, or just other aspects of Marxism that we would say, oh, he wasn't really a Marxist. Like he would say, King said Marx even straight from Hegel, so he was more Hegel than Marx. And I know it's kind of splitting hairs, but do you see a difference in in Marxism and King's kind of, I guess today we would call it democratic socialism, some type of like halfway point or cousin to Marxism or whatever. Do you see any kind of difference in that, or do you think the label of Marxism is fair for King?
Marxism is absolutely a fair description of who King was. I'll have to preface that answer by saying a couple of things. One, Vladimir Lenin called himself a democratic socialist before he took over Russia and called it the Soviet Union, and then they came out as communists. Surprise, surprise. The same is true of Fidel Castro. Before he gained power there in Cuba, he called himself a democratic socialist as well. I think folks just have to understand the communist playbook, the Marxist playbook, where they use those who are avowed communists as well as those who are so-called fellow travelers, all to reach their ends, their end goal. Even Karl Marx himself said in the latter pages of the Communist Manifesto that the communists team up with any democratic party or entity around the world, never losing sight of their goal. You know, they want to meet their end goal. And as we all know, Martin Luther King was a plagiarist. And when you look at to the extent that he disavowed communism, he didn't do so with his own words. He did so with the words of Robert J. McCracken. And so he literally plagiarized Robert J. McCracken's critique of communism to say that he wasn't a communist. And so my question is, if someone is genuinely not a communist, why would you have to plagiarize someone else to say so?
Yeah.
Why not use your own words to say, well, no, I'm not a communist and here's why. And so it just smacks of just being disingenuous. And then too, you know, the Bible says that you'll know a tree by its fruit. When you look at the fruit of Martin Luther King and what he was actually advocating for, a mass redistribution of wealth, a universal basic income.
Yeah.
When you look at the fact that he literally lobbied for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which expanded the role of the federal government. And that's in lockstep with Marxism, because Marxists seek to centralize the ownership of goods and production. So the only thing that you're achieving by giving the government, the federal government, more of a role in small businesses is incrementally inching more and more toward the ultimate goal of the government owning the means of production. And so I look at what he did more so than what he said, especially when what he said was plagiarized.
Yeah.
I am wondering, because you talk so much about the education system and how our education has been slanted to, you know, promote King and to promote the civil rights movement. How do you think our education got slanted that way? And and I know you hit on this earlier, but I'm really wanting you to maybe clarify, like it's because the intentionality is to, or is your position that the intentionality is to indoctrinate students into a worldview or a way of thinking, or to promote leaders that actually are more Marxist in their nature?
So that's actually a really good question, and hopefully I do a decent job answering it. I don't know that I will, but to answer your question, yes, there is an agenda with the public education system. People can read John Dewey's Education Fetish, which he wrote in, I think, 1898 or something of that nature, where he was advocating for the existence of the public school system. When you look at the education that not only whites were getting in the one-room schoolhouses prior to the popularization of public schools, but also blacks were getting, it was a superior education than what they would ultimately get whenever the schools were integrated. Just the ability to reason and to compute and to write. I mean, something as basic as writing. When you look at the doing away of phonics and other such things that help you become a well-rounded adult, because as we all know, or as we should all know, that learning to read is basic to all education, quite frankly. Because if you know how to read, then you know how to comprehend, or you're better able to comprehend you're better in biology and calculus and algebra and all of these other subjects when you know how to read, because you can consume information by way of books. I know that Dr. Ben Carson is a testament to this. Whenever his mother emphasized the importance of reading in the life of he and his brother, according to his memoir. But it's also basically true as well. But yes, when you look at education, there's this facade that the public education system is decentralized because you have in each state an education board, which is made up of people, of persons who are elected. And so the idea is that people come together and they elect the members of the school board. Therefore, you don't have anybody to blame but yourself if you don't like the way the education system is going. That might be true. However, when you look at the fact that they outsource the making of the curriculum, and you see that many of these organizations that make these curriculums are ideologically driven, and again, these people are secularists. And then, too, you look at the Supreme Court decision of Lemon v. Kurtzman, which said that the making of any curriculum or any law or policy has to be secular in nature, has to have a secular effect. Its end goal has to be that of secularism. And so the fact of the matter is, when you have the state, and I like the way that Dr. Vodi Bakum put it, we are in a sense entrusting Caesar to raise or to educate our children, and you can't be surprised when your children come home as Romans, when you send them to Caesar to be educated. And so when you look at the fact that children today are going to school and they're being taught the virtues of social justice, it begins to make sense why they laud people like Martin Luther King, like Helen Keller. I think she was deaf, blind, dumb, and mute. I'm not even sure what those she was. She couldn't see. Let me just say this. She couldn't see, she couldn't hear, she couldn't speak. But she was considered a prodigy and all these things. And then you look into her and she's advocating for labor rights and communism and socialism and all the things. So they're lauding people like Helen Keller. They're lauding people like all these individuals who happen to either be flat out Marxists or who are in favor of some kind of socialist ideology. You begin to make sense of the fact that, there's an agenda at play here. Right now, the big topic is climate change. Well, climate change is being used once again to push policy that is globalist, that is socialist in nature. And they say that, the number one advocacy for climate change today is the youth. Well, this isn't by accident. They're being taught to have this kind of social justice bent by way of the education system. So I could go on and on and on about this subject, but I know we're probably strapped for time. But there certainly is an agenda in our public school system.
You said two names I know most people don't even know were Marxists, and they were part of my childhood education. Helen Keller. She's from Alabama, so in the state of Alabama, Helen Keller was a big deal. Never knew she was a Marxist. And then you mentioned John Dewey. Everybody grew up learning the Dewey Decimal System. Nobody knew he was a communist. So our education system was just full of communists, and we had no idea.
Oh, I'm kind of in my emotions about the Helen Keller comment. I'm just gonna sit here.
Oh, you didn't know?
No, not even.
Oh, okay. I found out maybe a year or two ago that W.E.B. Du Bois was a communist. The NAACP was started. I didn't. It all made sense once you started looking into it. It's like, wait a minute, all these things that have been so uplifted to us and held up on a pedestal are communist in nature. And it's like, you just, it's clear why we believe the things we believe.
Right.
We hope you're enjoying our conversation with Shadow Jackson. We are going to take a quick time out to hear from our friends at Maven. Krista and I will be on the upcoming 2025 Maven tour. You can find out more information at mavenconferences.com.
Truth and courage. Christians need a good dose of both in this current cultural moment. That's why you need to be at the 2025 Maven Conference. We are going to look at the anti-Christian culture that we're currently in and the unique challenges that it presents to us. the challenges of expressive individualism, the authority of the self, and how that dominates so much of our society. And then also critical theory, the ideas that permeate every institution, and families and students need to figure out how to navigate those challenges. So join us in Southern California on Saturday, February 22nd for the Maven Conference. And there you'll get a good dose of both truth and courage. Go to mavenconferences.com to register.
But yeah, so yeah, there's one more clip. Let's get into this last clip, and then we can kind of wrap up.
You know, it's also worth noting that during the 2024 election cycle, Barack Obama said that American politics have become so polarized these days.
Our politics have become so polarized these days. All of us across the political spectrum seem so quick to assume the worst in others.
Yeah, first of all, it didn't just start these days. It goes back quite further than our current moment. And secondly, it stems from far more than just politics. It starts in part from an education system that insists on miseducating the children, specifically as it pertains to their understanding of the past. Barack Obama insists on pushing a narrative that says blacks and whites never got along voluntarily apart from an activist agenda or by way of government intervention.
Racial minorities insist that the government intervene more deeply into the private sector and civil society to root out long-standing systemic discrimination.
The reality is that prior to the civil rights movement, there were plenty of examples of blacks and whites getting along in such places as Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, North Carolina, on and on I can go. And they were doing so without the influence of activists or government intervention.
Oh, some things that happened.
I remember back in 2013 when Phil Robertson came under fire for daring to tell the truth about his own past.
Phil Robertson is known for speaking his mind on the Backwoods A&E program, but as CNN's Anderson Cooper shows us, it's what he said off camera that's got him in some hot water and suspended.
Robertson talked about his upbringing in the South before the civil rights era. He told GQ, quote, "I never with my eyes saw the mistreatment of any black person. Not once," he told GQ. He also said about African Americans, pre-entitlement, pre-welfare, you say, were they happy? They were godly. They were happy. No one was singing the blues. The NAACP and the Human Rights Campaign wrote a joint letter to A&E expressing outrage over his remarks.
The public reaction and disgust was quite peculiar to me. I mean, shouldn't it be good news that the Southern community in which Phil Robertson grew up consisted of blacks and whites who actually got along? Why does America want so badly for that not to be true?
Race relations have been set back 50 years in this country. Americans were previously gradually working out their problems, and when there were solutions of these problems, they came from the heart, and there wouldn't be any going back on them. It's different now. White Americans are taking sides. Negro Americans are taking sides.
As a historian, I can tell you definitively that to the extent that you had blacks and whites who are gradually but most assuredly coming together and getting along, you had around the corner communist activity hell-bent on disrupting that harmony. Why? Because as Manning Johnson said, they wanted the Negro to unite not with ordinary white people, but with the communists.
They wanted the Negro to unite with the white communists. That was their objective, not with the other white people, but with the white communists.
I can't help but think that Barack Obama and his ilk are a continuation of that same agenda. I mean, why else would he have someone like Al Sharpton at the White House continually under his presidency? Al Sharpton, the same guy who advocates for anger as a way to keep black people riled up. When the so-called leadership of such figures as Al Sharpton, Benjamin Crump, and others requires its followers to be angry, then you know you're dealing with a charlatan and a demagogue. Unfortunately, it doesn't only exist with Black America. this notion that we should keep the generations angry about things that happened in the past is something that perpetuates in American politics, in America's entertainment industry, in our education system, higher education, and increasingly the church.
Okay, so I'm going to play devil's advocate. I know we need to do the rap and all that, but I need to play devil's advocate because I can clearly see that people are going to say, but what about Plessy versus Ferguson? What about the separate but equal, the black water fountain and the white water fountain, the black seats and the white seats? And, you know, you on one hand, there's this idea that everyone was getting along, but then down the street, we would have the white, you know, entrance and the black entrance. Or looking at, and we've already, you know, had conversations about systemic racism and things like that. But what is your rejoinder, your comments to those who would say, well, that's only those 5 people, you know, in Selma who were getting along, but in reality, you know, all the other, you know, 3 million blacks in the South were really dealing with separate water fountains, separate movie theaters and entrances and all of that. Chad, you're wrong, or you're making this up. What would your comment be?
Well, I mean, in the piece, we give video footage, evidence of people, blacks and whites coming together, and then two, the best you could do is use firsthand accounts. As you saw, Phil Robertson gave his account of the fact that blacks and whites in the Louisiana backwoods town in which he grew up, that blacks and whites generally got along. And this is, I found this to be true with many people that I've interviewed over a certain age demographic, who, when being honest, can either never give any kind of example of overt racist treatment or even subliminal racist treatment, because even to the extent that you had separate drinking fountains and things of this nature, it wasn't viewed as a mark of inferiority by a lot of these black folks, contrary to what a lot of the sociologists and so-called intellectuals were arguing, who had a vested interest in certain legislations passed because they stood to benefit monetarily and otherwise. But I don't know. That's a very interesting question. Hopefully, I demonstrate it. Hopefully, I can answer it in this piece. And to the extent that people have questions, or still have questions even after the fact, I'll definitely be open to answer such questions if something's just still isn't made clear. But the reality of it is, you know, prior to a country like America, most countries around the world were homogenous. This idea of like this melting pot of different ethnic backgrounds being in one spot was a very new phenomenon, a very new idea. And again, you have to consider the fact that in the aftermath of a civil war, we've never experienced anything like that. The North fighting the South, a very bloody war, again, where persons lost the men of their family, their father, their son. There was the so-called lost cause. And so there's a lot of friction and animosity in the air. There was, in my opinion, wisdom in separating folks so as to try to mitigate violence. And it was working in many cases. Whenever you saw all of these uprisings, like in Rosewood or in Tulsa, again, these things happened after the second Congress of the Communist International, where Vladimir Lenin sent the word out to communists around the world, communists in America, to do anything necessary to try to win Negroes to your ranks. And then all of a sudden, all of these race riots start popping off across the South. I don't think that's a coincidence. But again, it's I think people, because we have the luxury of being raised born and raised in the latter part of the 20th century into the 21st century, where you had a technological boom, you had rapid industrialization. You had a lot of creature comforts such to where man hasn't known heretofore. It's easy for us to look at the past and say, yeah, how dare they separate blacks and whites and da, not realizing that man's history is far vaster than what we think we know. And when you look at such things as slavery, when you look at such things as, blacks and whites, in many cases, were both poor in those days, and they didn't have time to sit around and fight. They were. You saw blacks and whites in that footage that Kevin played earlier, where they were, harvesting tobacco and cotton together and things of this nature. They didn't have time to be at each other's throats like that. But that's the narrative that we're given, once again, because there's capital in our anger and our being discontent and dissatisfied and feeling that we will never be free until what? We don't know. We need an activist to tell us. But we will never be free.
Yeah, 400 years.
Yeah.
My takeaways from it is, one, as Black people, we need to understand not just the history that we're given, but doing research and looking at what are some of the pieces of history that we don't know, that aren't just fed to us, on a spoon in our public education, at least my public education. How do I look in and look at both sides of a conversation in history? And so, really looking for truth, not just for this one narrative that is highly pumped throughout our society. And so I appreciate that. I think even looking at, some of the ways in which we do see Black uplift, and the fact that there wasn't Black uplift without white participation. Well, where is that white participation coming from if everything is segregated and everything is just Blacks and whites at each other's throats, never getting along, white people just seeing Black people as, subhuman and things like that? That isn't, the case. Was there and is there today still, real instances of racism and racial violence and prejudice and things like that? Of course. And I would say that is also something that throughout human history has gone human to human, not just white to Black. But we won't know that if we aren't doing our due diligence to actually take a look into our history and to see, where have humans missed the mark. So I'm glad that you tackled that, Chad, and that, you're helping us see something that isn't talked about ever, that is actually taboo to even, bring to the forefront. But it's something that we need to be talking about, and something that we don't, as Christians, we don't just want to run with a narrative. We just don't want to run with, something that might be a lie simply because it sounds good in the moment. How do we actually stand for truth? And so, yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I would add to that is, to your question, Monique, about, so the term woke is what I think about, because we know that term is not a new term. That term goes back to, and my question was, if racism and discrimination and oppression was just so prominent and overwhelming to the Black community, who would need to be woke to that? Like, who would need to be awakened to it? So this idea that there were some Black people who were woke, who were awakened to the oppression, there were some who weren't. That tells me that this prevalent cloud of racism and discrimination wasn't as prevalent as we're told. Otherwise, there would be no need to be woke, because that would just be the norm, But the fact that we need Black people to be awakened to oppression, that tells me something. That tells me that the narrative that we are told is not as, pun intended, black and white as they lay it out to be, And so, and that's what I love about Chad's documentaries, the footage, firsthand accounts, people's own words of that day it tells us so much more than revisionist history, And so that's what I appreciate about his documentary.
Chad, what do you want people to walk away with at the end of the day?
Well,
like after seeing
what I want,
your documentary?
Yeah, what I want for people to do is to begin to take down a lot of their the idols that they have set up, even the idols that they think are are good. I mean, I guess naturally, if it's an idol, you think it's good, but basically, just reconsider people that they put on pedestals in terms of their own lives. I mean, I know for me, I used to go to a church. I'm not going to mention the name of the church, but I went because the pastor, like he was a celebrity pastor, and he was this and he was that, and it wasn't until certain things happened that I realized, like, oh, okay, well, he's preaching some blasphemy or what have you. But this is a mega church, and a lot of people go to this particular church because of the celebrity of this particular individual, and so someone, whether it's somebody like a Martin Luther King or anyone else for that matter, we know that we're given elders and deacons and pastors and preachers and teachers to guide the flock. We know that we're given these individuals, but it's to the extent that you begin to make idols out of these people that you begin to develop these ideologies, these philosophies that are not biblical at all. And it's important, in my opinion, to stay grounded in the truth, to stay grounded in the word. And so that's basically what I want people to come away with. This is a film that's directed more so to the church than anyone else. There's a lot of Christians who hold Martin Luther King in such high esteem, and it begins to make sense when you begin to consider their take on certain issues as it relates to social justice, which are unbiblical conclusions to come to. And so a lot of these people who have these views about social justice feel as if they are well-intended in their beliefs because they are starting from this narrative of everything is unjust as it relates to race, and look at our past and look at this and look at that. And again, like I think of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, where it says, don't call conspiracy what these wicked people call conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, but fear God. And so it's to the extent that the church is fooled by these, by these claims and these accusations that are being made by the unbelieving world, that we begin to fall for their solution to the problem they say exists. But what my hope is that people will once again just ground themselves in the Word of God and not fall susceptible to the hollow and deceptive philosophies, to not fear what the secular world fears, but to fear God. And that's one of the biggest issues that I see as it relates to this this Marxist agenda, specifically as it relates to their setting their sights on the church. Their attempt to subvert the church. They fed a bunch of lies to these people. A lot of them fell for it, and then the rest is history. And so I want for folks to get back to God, quite frankly. And so when you look at Martin Luther King, someone who's supposed to be a religious figure, it's important to understand that he didn't believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. It's important to understand that he didn't believe in a literal existence of heaven and hell. It's important to understand that he didn't believe in the second coming. It's important to understand, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then too, I don't really talk a lot about his, sleeping with many women and having the orgies, the fact that, the night before he died, he gave the mountaintop speech. I've been to the mountaintop and I looked over and I saw this, that, and the third. To leave from that location where he gave that sermon, go sleep with one woman and then go sleep with another woman at the Lorraine Motel, and then go upstairs to his room and basically get into a fight with a woman who worked for the SCLC, who they called his second wife, because she didn't like the fact that he was sleeping with these other women. He apparently, allegedly, according to Ralph Abernathy, who was his closest friend, beat her up, and then he died the next day. She stormed off. He didn't see her again, and then he got assassinated the next day. So these are things that are important to understand, because he was living this double life. He wasn't a real reverend. And he was basically just using the cloth to push a Marxist agenda. These are things that are important to understand for the church to understand, because the sooner we do that, the sooner we can get back to worshiping Christ and not man. And then the last thing I'll say is this: to the extent that you have Christians who say, well, we yeah, all those things may be true of King, but what about the fact that he said, let's judge people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character? Well, what I always say is that, Jesus did one better. He said to love your neighbor as yourself. And so why look to King to teach us how to love our neighbor when Christ, who is the basis of Christianity, who our Christian faith is supposed to be centered around, said it far better 2,000 years earlier? So the fact is, we don't need to put King or anyone else, for that matter, in the place of Christ. We have the one who intercedes on our behalf, who sits at the right hand of God. We don't need to put King in that place. And so my hope is that, once again, people begin to tear down those idols.
Like, as always, this has been good, and we got to have you on more often than every 2 years, But before we get out of here, just kind of tell people where they can find you, where they can find your work, and where they can find the documentary when it comes out on the 20th.
Yeah, so the documentary will be released for free on my YouTube channel at Chad O. Jackson. People could also find me on X at Chad O. Jackson, and Instagram as well. I will say that I'm working diligently to get the documentary finished. My hope is to have it done by the 20th, but there's a chance that I might not be able to get it done just because of the editing and everything, trying to get it all honed in. I will have something released on the 20th. It might not be the whole thing, but it will at least be something. But as far as the final product that I'll be happy with, it will probably be, if I'm not finished by 20th, it'll probably be mid-February. And I hope to do a premiere in a theater in Atlanta in late February during Black History Month, so that people can come and see it in person.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So either way, people, go to Chad O. Jackson on YouTube and just go ahead and subscribe, hit that notification bell so you're notified whenever he posts things. Man, Chad, this has been good, man. Like I said, we appreciate you taking the time to come on, and we'll have to do it again soon.
Yes, because I know people are going to have questions.
Thank you.
You've made a lot of claims, like the last, couple of sentences about his extramarital affairs and, Abernathy and, all of these things. They are claims. And I'm sure that people will say, well, what are the receipts for that? Well, you can also go out and do your own research. I would say definitely watch the documentary, but the conversation and the information is also out there as well. And so we want to make sure that
the question about the extramarital affairs, I can answer that question right now. The walls came tumbling down by Ralph Abernathy. He was Martin Luther King's closest friend. And he wrote this book that was released in the, I think, late 80s, shortly before he died. But he admits all these things. He was he was closest to MLK than any of the others.
There's also, wiretaps, and there was a whole documentary, I remember, and I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but a whole documentary that was done on King and the assassination and, his extramarital affairs and all of that. And so the information is out there. We're not, wanting to just create a podcast, create a whole bunch of claims and then be like, hey, some of this could be false. No, the information is there as well. And so, as we would say biblically, we need to be Bereans. We also need to be social or cultural Bereans as well, and go and study and make sure that we also have the information that is available to us, because this information is available.
Yeah, right. It is. We're just not taught.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
Yep.
So,
Chad, thank you so much for hanging out with us. This went long, but it was good. Except for Helen Keller, because dang. For real. Thank you so much. And yes, we would love to have you back and just continue the conversation. There's so much history here that we just don't know. And it's really important, and not just important to Black people. but it's important to us as as a society and as, the church, especially as we, continue to want to speak truth and promote truth. So thank you for your work and for hanging out with us.
Thank you. Thank y'all for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks. All right, Kevin. It's about that time.
Yeah, it is.
Break
It
for
is.
the rhythm and the rhyme. And I was playing. Always about a song. Kevin, this was a good conversation. Thank you for this idea. Thank you for putting it all together. Man, you have upped the bar for me. My gosh.
This was something I felt, when I saw Chad putting it out there, he was doing this project. I was like, we have got to get him on. We got to talk about it because, like he said, if we can break down the idols, we can get people to turn back to God and not feel like they have to hold on. And I'm going to put it in these terms. They don't have to feel like they have to hold on to this thing called blackness that is rooted in a lot of these things that have nothing to do with who we are or were as a people prior to a certain point. And so, I just hope people like Chad said, break those idols and turn back to God.
Amen and amen. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you for hanging out with us. We know this episode was a little longer, but we definitely appreciate your time and for just being a part of the conversation. Leave your comments in the comment section. Make sure that you like and subscribe to our page. Share this conversation out. Hear what some of your friends think. Maybe this is history that your friends don't know, or maybe they actually know more than what we've already put out. We would love to hear the feedback. Offcode is a podcast from the Center for Biblical Unity. You can check out the Center for Biblical Unity on Facebook or Instagram, or by going to our website, centerforbiblicalunity.com. And we will see you in 2 weeks. You guys have a great night. Bye.